Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and my mission is to use this space to bring content to you to help you understand your struggle with food and break free from binge eating. And today's video is all about food obsession, which is basically thinking about food constantly. So it's waking up in the morning and the first thought being, what did I eat yesterday? It's like debating with yourself whether you should or you shouldn't eat something. When are you going to eat next? And should you have had that? Having a go at yourself for eating too much or congratulating yourself for eating little. It's being at a social event where there's food out and all you can think about is the food to the point where it's hard to even follow the conversation. And so when we look at recovery from binge eating, we need to look at like these thoughts that we're having because that's a huge part of what's driving the behavior. And it's really a challenging part of getting your life back. You can't live a free and peaceful life when you're being controlled by just thoughts of food all the time, which can cause a huge amount of anxiety or depression or just not feeling great at all. So in this video, I've come up with 7 things that you can do to reduce food obsession. But firstly, just to look at it quickly, like some of the reasons why we might become obsessed with food is, well, firstly, hunger, sort of goes without saying, but the hunger hormone ghrelin, its job is to make you think about food. And our hormones can have such an impact on our thinking. You know, anybody who's experienced hormonal swings and what that can do to your mood and how you view the world and those around you, you can see how powerful hormones can be at taking over our thinking processes. So if we've got hunger hormones going around our body, we're going to think about food a lot. And also the mental restriction side of it as well. Like if you are telling yourself you mustn't have something that you normally enjoy and it's available, that might also increase sort of obsession, food obsession around particular types of food as well. It also becomes quite big in our minds because it's become sort of inextricably linked with our values and how we see ourselves. So when food has become about, you use food as the barometer to judge how you're doing and to judge your worthiness, then of course it's going to become really important in the brain. So the brain is going to over-focus on food to try and make you feel okay about yourself. But it just often has the opposite effect, but it becomes a bit of a self-sabotaging cycle, which sort of leads on to that idea of trying to get it right. You probably believe there is a right way of eating for you. You should be eating a certain way. Even if it's something like intuitive eating, you can turn it into another should. Yeah. And when we're trying to get something right and we feel like we keep making mistakes and we're supposed to be able to master this, we may find that our brains will latch onto that and have a lot of thoughts about it. Like if I asked you to go and get me a glass of water, you would probably be able to do that without really thinking about it because it's something you've done so many times before. But if I asked you to go and make me a coffee with a really fancy coffee machine with all these buttons and stuff that you'd never used before, like there would be like uncertainty, there would be questions, there'd be like a lot of thoughts, is this right? Do I press this button at this time? Should I be doing that? Like all these things that are going to go on in your mind. And it kind of becomes the same with food. You're trying to figure out with your thinking mind what it is you believe you should be eating. And that is going to create like a lot of thoughts, a lot of this sort of trying to figure stuff out, which just becomes really unhelpful with food. And the other thing that makes those food thoughts so sticky is emotion. So when we have a thought that's connected with a strong emotion, the brain prioritizes it because it notices the effect that the thought's having and then says, okay, it flags it and is like, this thought is important. It's a little bit like why, if you think back to your childhood memories, the things that you remember will be the things that have normally a strong emotional attachment, good or bad. And we tend to remember where we were when we hear bad news, for example. So there's really this link between how we feel about something and then how often we're likely to keep thinking it. So what can we do? Well, firstly, eat enough. I'm not going to labour that one. I've talked about this plenty enough on other videos. But yeah, if you're trying to restrict, you're going to become obsessed with food. It is not possible Trust me, it's not possible to restrict your food intake to any significant degree without becoming obsessed with food. And every person that I've worked with anorexia thinks about food pretty much every second of the day. So just that needs to be addressed first. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting your biology on that one. And secondly, what I often see happening with things like this is that people take over responsibility for their thoughts, or they take under responsibility for their thoughts. It's like the ultimate black and white, all or nothing thinking comes to life here. So what do I mean by that? Over responsibility looks like blaming yourself. So like that really critical, harsh voice, like, why can't you just be normal around food? Like, why can't you just focus on this or focus on that? Like, why can't you just stop doing this, right? That's the blame over responsibility. It's not possible to just stop when this has been going on probably for as long as it has. And then there's the under responsibility, which is that feeling of complete helplessness. It's like, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm never going to be able to make this any better. And we kind of like ball into ourselves. A lot of the time it's a swing between the two. You know, you'll go from like that self-blame critical place to feeling helpless. And it's a swing, and neither of those are helpful because you can't change this from either of those places. So like the second thing to do is to recognize that there is a middle ground. There's a middle ground where we can have some influence on our thinking. There are some things that we can do, but it doesn't mean that we can like just put a wall up and refuse to think things that we don't want to think. Like, thoughts are going to come up. They exist as neural networks in the brain, right? So they're just going to fire off and we're going to have them. But we do have some influence about where we put our intention and attention that can serve us and help us move away from food obsession. And the third one is to accept that you'll never get it right when it comes to food. There is always a choice that could have been in some way better than whatever you've chosen to eat or not eat. And we'll get it wrong sometimes. Sometimes we won't eat enough, and sometimes we will feel like we've eaten too much. I went to a friend's recently around lunchtime and I hadn't had lunch because I thought that might be what we were going to do, and that wasn't the case. And there were just crisps out and a few snacks out, and I ended up eating more of the snacks than I would have wanted to. But ultimately, like, I hadn't had lunch. I know that the hunger, that I was feeling hungry. And whilst it wouldn't have been my preference to have done that instead of having a lunch, you know, that's what happened. And there was no guilt or difficult feelings attached to that. It was just, it was what it was. So this idea that you can somehow eat perfectly, eat in a way, because now, like, if you have a day where you think you've eaten perfectly, you probably almost feel a bit high about that. Like, you feel incredibly strong and powerful, and aren't I great that I've managed to control my eating so well? But that's not sustainable. And if that's what you are fighting for, then you will keep like having to overthink food to try and get it to a point where you can feel really happy and satisfied with yourself. And it's normally unrealistic expectations, and for most people it's normally restrictive. And the fourth one is, I mentioned earlier about values. To spend some time thinking about, like, what do you really value in your life? What is really important to you? We are all going to leave this planet at some point. And I know that sounds a bit heavy for a binge eating video, but ultimately, like, these bigger questions about life and purpose and, you know, what is it that you want to leave behind? What is it you want to feel like you brought into this world or you contributed? Probably not a perfect body when you really sit down and think about it. And like a lot of values that we have around food and our bodies, they've been taught to us, right? They've been taught to us by the culture that we live in. And then if you had it in the home as well, it's like a double whammy. So the fact that you value food and what you eat and what your body looks like so much is not your fault. But also it wasn't your original value, it was a taught one. So that idea of being able to sit down and be like, what is actually important to me? Now do this gently, don't beat yourself up that food has become such a value in your life. It just has, you know, and there are reasons for that. But when we kind of gently think about, like, where do I want to be putting my energy and my attention, then we might start to make space for other things that we value that have kind of been forgotten a bit or been pushed down and out the way because food became so big that other things had to shrink in order to make space for it. So bringing some attention to those parts of you that have had to shrink down to make space for food, I think will serve you well. Which sort of brings me on to number 5, which is, okay, so you don't want to be thinking about food all the time. What would you like to be thinking about instead? Like, our minds don't want to be empty. I mean, maybe certain people can get into a meditative state where they are, but like for a lot of us, our minds are used to being busy. They're almost addicted to being busy, and to just think we could remove all those food thoughts, like what would be left, right? So again, I know, like I was telling you, I'm giving you 7 things to do and I'm making you do all the work, right? But ultimately, like I could give you suggestions, but if you figure these things out for yourself, in order to do that, your brain has to build new neural networks. So when you start thinking about, like, what are the things that you're not doing that you would be doing if food wasn't a struggle for you? And that idea of like introducing stuff now, because people think, right, I want to get rid of all the food stuff and then I'll live my life and fill it up with other things. It doesn't work like that. That's how people stay stuck. It's like you need to start filling up your life with other things in order for the food stuff to reduce. So there's kind of this dissonance because you think, well, I'm not ready to do those things. You probably won't ever feel ready to do these things, whatever they might be. But taking some time to consider then, like, what is it that you imagine that you would put all this energy that goes into food and changing your body? Where would you direct that? I think, yeah, I encourage you to really, really think about that question, because it comes back to this idea that food, when you've struggled with food, that can almost become like part of your identity. And particularly like with eating disorders, there is often this question like, who would I be without my eating disorder? And you can't wait to get rid of your eating problems to figure out who you are. It's like you have to figure out who you are or who you want to be in order to figure out your eating struggles. And so the 6th one is a little bit more practical. It's actually a technique that Gabrielle Bernstein teaches, and I think she calls it like forgiving your thoughts or something like that. So the idea is that when you have a thought that you don't want to be thinking anymore because you recognise it just doesn't serve you, you catch the thought when you have it. So there needs to be some intention, I think, around this about paying attention to your thoughts. So let's say you eat something and the thought is, you have a piece of chocolate and the thought is, I shouldn't have eaten that. And you know that that thought is not a good thought for you because that then leads to the all or nothing thinking, is more likely to lead to a binge than if you had a different response, right? But the thought, the automatic thought, because it's come up again and again, is I shouldn't have eaten that. So you recognise, step 1 is to recognise I've just had that thought that I shouldn't eat that. And then the next step is that you forgive the thought. So this idea that we are not our thoughts, we are more than our thoughts. And so our thoughts, they just exist as these neural networks in our mind. They have this physical existence. And thoughts that we've thought again and again are going to be triggered off by certain situations. The situation being you've had something that you normally think you shouldn't eat, and that's triggered the thought, I shouldn't have eaten that. So you just forgive the thought. You're not forgiving yourself for having the thought. You forgive this thought for existing. And in that, you kind of let it go. There's no conflict around it. There's no tussling with the thought. It's just like, okay, I've had the thought, and I forgive the thought for existing. And then the 3rd step is you ask yourself, what would I prefer to think instead? So what is it that you want to replace the thought with in that situation? When you find that thought for yourself, that's where you're growing new neural networks. There's no point taking somebody else's thought and trying to make it yours. That can work, but I just don't think it's as powerful as when you realise something for yourself. That just seems to go in more like a core level. So there's something about identifying the thoughts that are really derailing you and just having a go at working through these steps with it. And you'll need to be patient with this because this stuff doesn't change overnight, right? That's the intention, to keep doing it. And you'll probably need to do this several times with the same thought before it will occur to you in that same situation to think differently. But it's one way of trying to like bridge your thoughts and move it more towards what it is that you want to be thinking. And step number 7, that I think is really, really helpful for me anyway, and I hope it helps you too, is to remind yourself on a daily basis that you don't need to believe everything you think. We have a thought and we think that the reason we're thinking that thought is because we're just realising something true. So back to the example, like you eat a piece of chocolate and you think, I shouldn't have eaten that chocolate. You think you are realising that you shouldn't have eaten the chocolate, as opposed to this is a thought that just comes up again and again and may not be true. So I found this, because my thinking is naturally catastrophic. I am a fellow black and white all or nothing thinker. So my tendency can be to go there. And when I catch myself, I can sometimes say, this may not be true. This feels true right now because my emotions are aligned with my thoughts, right? So in that moment, it is my truth. But when I just cast that shadow of doubt over it, I'm not arguing with the thought. I'm not trying to convince myself that everything's fine if it doesn't feel fine. But I'll say to myself, this may not be true. This is what you're thinking now, and you might think and feel something different later. And often we do. It's that idea, like before a binge, convincing yourself, I have to binge and I'm never going to feel okay unless I binge. And then afterwards, thinking completely differently, like, no, that wasn't the right thing and that didn't feel good, and whatever else that might come with that. So our thoughts and feelings can be quite fickle. And when we just accept that, as opposed to beating ourselves up for being so changeable in our thoughts and moods, we can be less controlled by them. So hopefully some of these things were helpful. And let me know your thoughts. And I will see you on the next video.